Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I am Lisa Poggiali. I am a Senior Democracy Data and Technology Specialist in USAID Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. And I work broadly on strategy, policy, and programs to strengthen technology's use, development, and governance so that it's better aligned with respect for human rights and democratic values. I'm very pleased to be moderating this event today, and I will turn the floor over to Kimberly Ludwig, the Office Director of the USAID Kenya Office of Democratic Governance, Peace, and Security to kick us off. Kimberly, over to you.
Here we go. Okay, can you hear me, Lisa?
I can, loud and clear.
I believe I'm looking at the camera now. All right, well, a warm welcome to everyone here. I'm Kimberly Ludwig. I'm the director of the USAID Office of Democratic Governance, Peace, and Security. And I'm very happy to be here representing the USAID Kenya and East Africa office. The research on countering violent extremism, which will be presented here today, focuses on a critical issue that impacts all sectors of social, economic, and political life here in Kenya. USAID's research shows that 90% of Kenya's counties have a high or medium risk of insecurity or conflict that is driven by ethnic competition and antagonism, disputes over natural resources, land grievances, violent extremism, exclusion, and poverty. Many times, extremist groups prey on areas or groups with existing conflict in order to recruit. For example, Kenya experiences armed conflict and insecurity associated with environmental stresses relating to climate change, such as drought and its socioeconomic impacts. In addition, underlying ethnic tensions are used by politicians to pursue their own interests by manipulating young people to engage in violence. Despite the risks, Kenya is countering violent extremism with 47 county action plans for CVE. These were completed within 6 months of the Dusit attack. The United States supported this countrywide effort. However, it's important to note that women are the main victims of conflict, and current responses to violent extremism are neither sufficiently gender specific nor gender sensitive. Tackling development challenges includes preventing and countering violent extremism. The more we understand about the dynamics and socio-political shifts, the more we can adapt our programming to strengthen weaknesses. We work in a complex and sensitive environment, and we can't afford to get things wrong. We take evidence seriously. All of our programming is built on data collection, analysis, and discussion with communities and local stakeholders. By investing in in-depth research, we can build better programming, mitigate risks and gaps, and provide more concise and meaningful support to the communities and individuals that we support. This means partnering with a variety of voices at the county level, including civil society, county government, and the private sector, to promote the priorities of the people of Kenya, to give perspective, and to deepen the learning experience. So with this in mind, we must address CVE activities from a whole of community lens. We can't address only the at-risk youth or communities. We need to broadly engage and communicate with entire communities, including local support networks that shape how violent extremism is perceived and set the social and cultural norms within which all actors, including the young people, operate. I'd like to hand over now to the researchers and panelists to present their research and findings. And we're very much looking forward to the discussions today. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Kimberly, for those remarks. I will set the stage a little bit before turning it over to two of the researchers for initial presentations. I'll say I had the great pleasure of working with USAID Kenya and RUSI in supporting this research when I was in USAID's Africa Bureau. And the research was a really wonderful collaboration between USAID's Africa Bureau, RUSI, Search for Common Ground, and also Human Cognition, who provided expert insights regarding online messaging and propaganda content analysis. Just to very briefly sort of give some of the background, Kenya was chosen as the site for this research for three main reasons. The first being that the violent extremist problem in Kenya began to change. We noticed this a couple of years ago. And so while violent extremist recruitment had been overall decreasing, the presence of violent extremist actors was expanding into new areas of the country. So for those of you who know Kenya, that would be Central Province and Western Province. And the profile of violent extremist actors also was expanding. So recent converts to Islam, Kenyan citizens, etc. So there were some new dynamics to explore and understand there. And then the second reason is that the government of Kenya, with the support of USAID, had institutionalized CVE via decentralized structures at the county level. So it became increasingly important to examine those CVE structures and communication patterns at that local level in order to better understand how the CVE activities were being perceived and actioned on. And then the third reason that Kenya was the site of this research is that evidence was suggesting that Kenyan communities oftentimes knew about violent extremist attacks before they occurred. So this was certainly the case with the Manda Bay attack in early January, but that they were not communicating this knowledge to those who might be able to stop those attacks. And so this led to an interesting question about why it was that community members were not sharing this information. And the RUSI team and Search for Common Ground and Human Cognition looked into this, and the findings are quite interesting. So looking forward to hearing more about them. So as I mentioned, you'll be hearing two presentations today, and then we will leave plenty of time for Q&A with the research team. So feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time throughout the presentation. We'll collect them and get to them in turn. And then just a quick note that if you're watching this on RUSI's YouTube site, you will not be able to view the Q&A. You'll actually get cut off. And so if you would like to participate and view the Q&A, please go to rusi.org/events, which is the RUSI website, so you can participate. That will enable you to get to the Zoom link, which is necessary to be a part of the Q&A. So I will introduce each of the researchers, very pleased to be able to do so. First, Christopher Hockey joined RUSI's Nairobi office as a research fellow in 2019. He's involved in several countering violent extremism projects in Kenya with an emphasis on research, monitoring, and evaluation, and violence tracking. And he's also involved in CVE training for the European Union delegation. Having been brought up in Kenya, Christopher previously worked in Nairobi's risk management space. Second, Michael Jones is a research fellow in RUSI's terrorism and conflict team, focusing on political violence, conflict, and violent extremism in Eastern Africa. He's led investigative fieldwork across various countries, including Sudan, Kenya, and Lebanon. And he's managed projects focusing on preventing and countering violent extremism and wider conflict systems in Somalia. Third, Timothy Kimayo has served as project assistant at RUSI's Nairobi office since August 2018. For 4 years, he's been involved in managing field data collection, both quantitative and qualitative, and supporting capacity building activities. He holds a Master of Arts in Economics and a Bachelor of Economics with first-class honors. Both are from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And then last but not least, Omar Salem is a Research, Evaluation, and Learning Officer with Search for Common Ground's Institutional Learning Team. He leads a variety of research and evaluation projects across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in support of Search for Common Ground's peace-building mission. So without further ado, I will hand it over to the RUSI research team to begin the presentations.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Allow me to share my screen. I hope that is now visible to everyone. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. This has been a huge project for us here in Nairobi. It took quite a long time, sort of a year and a half study in the end. And it, I think, has borne really interesting results that could have real implications for the CVE space. So we're very excited to finally be able to present this to you today. The study and the reporting that came out of it was pretty long. So in the sort of 15 minutes I have today, I'm not going to be able to go through everything, but I'll try and cover some of the key highlights and entice you into reading the products that came out of the research. So just to start with the intention behind this product, to build on some of what Lisa said, we really wanted to go beyond understanding drivers of recruitment and factors, which there has been quite a lot of research on in the Kenyan and East African context. So what we did was applied an academic at UCL her theory towards moral ecology, which is the idea of understanding how extremist enabling environments emerge through highly localized information ecosystems in which people exist, and understand how social norms are created through exploring information sharing networks and how those networks drive and shape values and social values and actions in relation to extremism. So it's quite a different approach, and we really wanted to understand the broader ecosystem that was driving and enabling this problem that we've had in Kenya for so long. In order to do so, we looked at four counties in the country: Nairobi, Mombasa, Nyeri, and Kwale. And within those counties, we looked at some very specific areas. So in Mombasa, it was Kisauni, Majengo, and Likoni. In Nairobi, for example, it was Eastleigh, and in Kwale, mainly Ukunda, but also Msambweni. And ultimately wanted to provide recommendations that could improve the CV space, make sure that it was better targeted, took better note of the local context, and overall to improve efficacy of programming. And this was in the context of a mounting criticism, I think, globally of CV for its failure to sort of prove its impact, especially CV projects related to communications. Kenya provided the perfect case study for this, as Lisa's explained, but I think the findings are relevant well beyond our borders. So three main areas, three main research questions. Firstly, we wanted to understand the violent extremist networks, how propaganda is used, how it's shared, both online and offline, and how that information shapes these values and norms and perceptions of these issues, which I mentioned. Secondly, we wanted to understand CV messaging, so both government messaging and CV civil society messaging, but not just the messaging, how that sector, the whole movement of programs working against this problem have sort of are shaping and changing attitudes. And finally, to see whether there's any crossover between these two, because if there isn't, clearly we're working with the wrong people, and we need to change that. So to answer these pretty broad questions, we needed to adopt some pretty innovative methods. And to do so, we brought in experts from Search for Common Ground, who you'll hear from shortly, who were able to use their understanding of social network analysis, for example, to better understand what's going on within these communities. We also were able to draw on the expertise of human cognition for sort of online network analysis and better sort of content analysis of jihadist propaganda in the region. So each of these methods, along with RUSI's qualitative, KIIs and FGDs, for example, were mutually reinforcing. They were able to build on each other, fill gaps that others were leaving. So amongst the methods, first, obviously, we conducted a literature review. This sort of situated the program, the study within the programming context, and global debates on CVE and on jihad. There was an extensive content analysis of the sort of material which Al-Shabaab primarily were pumping out. Then Human Cognition conducted their analysis of online networks. The field research really was began sort of 6 months into the study, and amidst COVID, so which obviously added considerable challenges. And this research primarily involved KAIs, but a huge number, sort of in total about 140 people were interviewed from local organizations, imams, members of county government and the county engagement forums, national government, youth and women across the 4 counties. We also conducted 7 to 9 focus group discussions in each county, and where possible, although this was difficult amidst COVID, we conducted sort of participant observation with ongoing activities on the ground. And we used local researchers who are well known to the communities to do this qualitative work. And all guides, all interviews were developed in collaboration with the local teams and administered in the language of respondents' choice. This social network analysis I'm going to leave broadly for Omar to speak about shortly. But effectively, there was two components. One looking at county engagement forums and those working in local government against violent extremist recruitment, but also amongst at-risk youths and how information flows between them. And each of these perspectives, as I said, provided, different methods provided different perspectives on each of the research questions. So there's a huge amount of findings, as I said, and I'll try and highlight a few that we think are particularly significant here, but it will only be a selection. So we really encourage you to read the final reports. The first thing I want to mention, and this is perhaps not surprising, is that CVE is really poorly understood amongst communities. If it's not poorly understood, it's very differently understood amongst communities that people are working with, as opposed to the government, and again, as opposed to those working in CVE. Much of this was expected and had actually been shown in 2 previous studies in Kenya. But community definitions we found were driven by lived experiences, by sort of quotidian concerns, and this could have included gang crime, as it suggests here, but also could have included local communal violence, for example, whatever sort of was the most immediate threat. And in particular, we were interested to see that when we spoke about these issues with most people in Kwale, they immediately spoke about police violence and saw the police in many cases as the VE actors. That was the message we got from the communities we were talking to. Intriguingly, especially as we pursue more for further research on this idea of a crime-terror nexus, we found that some local criminal groups, often very young teenage gangs, were beginning to adapt sort of religious tropes and ideas of and Islamist ideas and jihadist tropes to justify their own actions, their own criminal activities and attacks against non-local Kenyans. And I think that was, we wanted to highlight that because we wanted to show that, you know, rather than talking about very high-level organization between maybe criminal gangs and terrorist groups, often it's very low-level. And you know, if we understand these issues from a community perspective, then I think we can sort of start deconstructing that idea of this sort of grand nexus. Another thing we found, which Omar will speak a bit more about, is that communities and government actors both really externalize the problem. So often suggest it's not something that they're concerned about or not something that affects them, but it might affect their friends or someone very close to them, or it might be not relevant to their ward within a county, but it affects the ward next to them. And this sort of externalization narrative was pretty consistent across the country. In terms of understandings of the drivers of VE, they were sort of mostly driven around structural issues. So everyone, you know, named things like unemployment, poverty, discrimination, and marginalization. None of this was particularly surprising and has been found before, but they are things that CVE actors need to be much more aware of when they start designing PCV programs in new spaces. Findings related to extremist messaging. Again, I've highlighted just a few here. I think in particular, it's really significant that over the last 10 years in Kenya, mosques and key ideologues are no longer necessarily the most important drivers of recruitment in terms of driving the messaging. The greatest influence on those we've considered at risk seem to be sort of very close-knit family networks or peers. These tight-knit groups are often very gendered, so we found that men would share with men and girls would share with girls, or boys would share with boys within these communities, and often the information provided to one wouldn't necessarily reach the other gender. Similarly, in Mombasa especially, we found that Christians would share with Christians and Muslims would share with other Muslims. And I think understanding those patterns of communication is really critical when we're trying to communicate with individuals in CVE. Secondly, this idea that social media was all important, we found needs to be challenged to a degree. Obviously, firstly, it varies considerably across the country, the use of social media. But secondly, very few people could provide tangible examples of where people had been recruited directly online, for example. It still felt that in most cases, recruitment was face-to-face. And finally, through the various methods, we were able to identify several examples of interaction between online and offline communications. So we found that Arabic speakers served as sort of interlocutors, able to translate certain online propaganda and redistribute it amongst their immediate peer network. We found that people gathered at maskanis or meeting places to discuss VE messaging that maybe one of them was able to show on a screen, for example. So there was a sort of constant crossover between online and offline. In terms of CVE messaging, and very unfortunately, we found that for civil society organizations, an association with government actors or with the state often led to a loss of credibility in the eyes of those they were working with. We found that trust in local figures, so religious leaders, chiefs, etc., is often really varied and idiosyncratic. So whereas there's a lot of assumptions around, say, religious leaders being particularly credible actors in this space amongst certain young men, we found that was very much, they're very much varied in the different locations of our research. This was true also of local chiefs and community authorities, so elders, for example. And it was the personalities, their connections, and their actions, rather than their position itself, which really drove that factor, or drove their credibility. Religious leaders remained critical as sources of information, but many felt they were unable to exert any significant influence due to fear of state control, for example, or a disconnect with youths. We found that CSOs were generally seen as more trustworthy, but often this varied and was sort of dependent on the extent to which they were seen as local actors, for example. And we also concerningly found that most sort of relied on this idea of awareness raising and the suggestion that all that was needed was to get the message out there. And this idea really neglects the sociological dimensions of communication and the wider factors which contribute to radicalization and recruitment, so other structural and enabling and individual incentives, for example, that lead to recruitment. Obviously, unsurprisingly, we looked at the CAPs, the county action plans for those not in Kenya. We found that the success of CAPs was really context dependent. It's very easy to criticize the implementation of CAPs nationwide, but really we found that in areas with a history and experience of civic activism, the CAPs were much more successful and the CEF networks were much more coherent. And the final factor I wanted to mention is that despite the fact that everyone felt that social media was all important, very few people mentioned online interventions that they'd come across or that communities had felt had a role to play. A couple more slides from me, and I think this one is a little bit more theoretical. So I'll just to try and explain how it all fits in with Noemi Bahana's idea of extremist enabling ecologies or moral ecologies. Firstly, we identified a series of factors which shape what she calls the enabling settings. So these are sort of mutually reinforcing factors which shape how people share information, who they share it with, and their relationship with the states. This sort of has implications for moral norms and the normalization of sort of alternative value systems. So effectively makes a recruitment perhaps more logical or even rational. I've highlighted 3 of these factors here. Fear is really, really critical. And Lisa mentioned the idea of reporting to authorities being a concern to USAID in formulating this study. We found that fear in Kwali really led to silence a lot of the time. It's easier to avoid discussing the subject at all than to risk outing oneself, for example. That's that was the general feeling we got. In terms of the internet, this came up repeatedly as a concern that not just as a source of information and propaganda, but really as a way in dividing societies and undermining social control mechanisms, and therefore exposing people to alternative value systems. And thirdly, this idea of westernization came up a lot as a concern in sort of breaking down community norms or traditional resolution mechanisms. And secondly, we identified a series of extremist enabling social ecologies. So these were community level features which dictated social cohesion. They could include things like ethnicity and migration or associated grievances with those, intergenerational tensions and divisions between youths and elders, but also sort of sectarian divisions, particularly in Nairobi, between different mosques, for example. And another section of our report looks in a little bit more detail at sources of resilience, recognizing that this is particularly contentious this term, but we looked at sort of the role that role models can play in mentorship, for example, or education in sort of providing resilience to these emerging social norms and emerging extremist enabling ecologies. So finally, before I hand over to Omar, I just wanted to identify, I'm not going to go through all of these on the screen, but identify that all of these findings really varied across the 4 counties we studied. And it really highlights that rather than just saying we need to better understand the context before we launch a PCV program, it really shows that we need to understand that at a very localized level, not just specific to the county, but often specific to the ward. So Msambweni had very different findings, for example, to parts of Akunda within Kwali. So as you can see there, the sizes of these networks varied considerably. The individuals who were potentially influential varied as well. And at that point, I'm gonna hand over to Omar to take us through some of the interesting findings from his specific part of the study.
Thank you, Topher. So to quickly, I guess, step back to methodology for a moment here, wanted to give an overview of what we did with snowball sampling. Some might refer to this as chain referral sampling, but we kind of used a unique approach here. And you'll notice the graphic here is representative of the kind of abstract network of individuals, or the theoretical network of individuals in Kenya who might be sharing AS or other VE content online or in person. And so we really wanted to use an approach where we could kind of discover and sample from that theoretical network. And so we started with RUSI's enumerators who have been working in the various communities, who helped us recruit 5 seed members who met a set of criteria, risk factors, something, for example, in recent converts to Islam, or had family members who had been to Somalia, or they themselves were returnees that were known to these enumerators. And we gave each of the 5 seed group members, after responding to our questionnaire, a token asking them to share their token with 5 people with whom they frequently, or most frequently, share and discuss issues affecting their community, and with whom they're likely to share content online or offline about those issues. So the idea was to try to get some of the spread through this network. And so we started with the 5 C group members that turned in those shared with an additional 25, and then an additional 125 for 155 in each of the 4 counties. And we used a kind of incentive structure to motivate this. So there was, each person was motivated to bring more people back to us. And on these tokens was an anonymous number, an anonymous kind of code that would let us know which subsequent respondent was linked to the preceding respondent. So we would have an anonymous way to kind of track who was tied to whom, giving us a sort of a tree network that then we could apply some interesting analytics to, and try to understand how information, create a model for how information and content in this case would be spreading in this more theoretical network. So we sampled the network. And with this, we really, different than other methods, the point here is interrelatedness and not necessarily independence, like with other types of survey methodology. So we really wanted to focus on how people are linked together. And there was a few interesting findings from that I'll highlight now. Topher, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the first and kind of most significant was that gender, or sharing rather, is a very gendered activity or gendered process. We found that across all 4 counties, with Nyeri being the least kind of extreme example, but that people were more likely to share these tokens physically. They had to do it physically. They were more likely to share them within their gender group, but there was some obviously overlap, people sharing with others. So we found that people tend to share this type of content within their gender group, within their in-group. Next slide, please, Topher. And to echo what Christopher was saying around externalization, one of our questions in our 40 question questionnaire was asking respondents whether or not they themselves have shared AS content or other VE organizations. But for the sake of this, we found that AS was Al-Shabaab was the most commonly known and shared. When asked themselves whether they whether they share information, they were more likely to say that someone close to them had shared information rather than themselves. So they were really trying to put the blame or externalize onto those close to them. The kind of catch here is we, with this method, knew who was close to them because that was the prompt of the token. So we can see that really the people that they said they're sharing information with were the very same people that they were saying were sharing, would share with them. So that discrepancy kind of shows how we can see that externalization and discontinuity in how people perceive their use of this content or their sharing of this content versus those close to them. Next slide, please. So the next piece here was the relational survey, and we started with a network mapping exercise of these county engagement forums in the 4 counties. And just to understand which organizations were participating, which organizations played which roles, and kind of categorize them. And then we gave them a survey, as you can see in the bottom left there, that kind of listed each organization and then asked each organization to respond and identify which type of relationships they share with the other organizations listed. So we had 2 questions. One, with whom do they share information? And the second question, with whom do they have formal partnerships with? And the animation there is showing the results, I believe, from Nyeri. And so we modeled those as a network to really try to understand where some of the bottlenecks are in information sharing and partnership relationships, to understand how those dynamics are working, and we speak to that a bit more in the report. And so here the emphasis on understanding the structure of these community engagement forums to better provide recommendations for how to proceed, or to see kind of where some of the issues might be in terms of coordinating around countering violent extremism. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, and so here's some additional results. These are just, again, a sampling of some of the results. So what we found was that in some of these forums, government actors tended to be either bridges or bottlenecks. And bridges being the more positive term there, and bottlenecks potentially being the more negative term, but it could be either or. So again, we're focused on the structure that these government organizations were in a place to either play as a bridge, so they could have a convening power to be sharing more information, or if information isn't going as we would like, then they might be in a bottleneck role. And we also found that to a slightly less degree with NGOs, nonprofit actors. And you can see in the visualizations here that it's the red nodes are the government organizations, and the larger the node, the more they are often on the shortest path between all other nodes. So they have a higher betweenness centrality, and that shows that they are in a position to kind of play a mediating role in that group. Next slide, please. And here, faith-based organizations are where we found across most of the counties that played a really important role in partnership, especially in information sharing. And you see that in these networks that NGOs and governments and even for-profits are interested in engaging and partnering with them, especially around getting information around potentially what's going on in the community. So they play a really kind of a hub role in these networks, and are structurally important, but there were few in our mapping exercise. So that I guess means they're even more key. And I think that was it for my slides, Topher. I'll give it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Omar. We're running slightly over time, so I will try and highlight just a few of the key recommendations before we open up to questions. We separated our recommendations into 3 categories. So general findings that sort of led to direct lessons learned for CV and communications more broadly. Then those which directly spoke to CV programs, and then some which spoke directly to government actors and how the government perhaps needs to rethink some of its strategies. I want to highlight just a few of the general ones. There's this section of the report is very, very long. The recommendations took up a significant part of the document, so please do look at them. But from the general perspective, we found that CV programs don't as we said, don't identify the peer-to-peer networks, don't communicate through peer-to-peer networks, and that's something that they need to adapt to and to do so, rather than perhaps always going through credible messengers, for example. We need to identify how people are influencing their friends and family. Secondly, rather than sort of simply pumping out counter messaging content, we need to recognize that there are social dynamics that frame how information received, interpreted, and circulated, and incorporating communications activities within wider multidimensional approaches, so involving action and activity that builds relationships is perhaps a better way to go than just pumping out a message. This is something that Rusi has written quite a lot about in its sort of critique of stratcoms and communications counter narratives. And thirdly, we need to recognize the importance of public-private partnerships, because, as I said, despite an emphasis on socioeconomic grievances, very rarely were private entities even involved in this sort of work, and that was a real concern for us. We need to recognize that there's this disjuncture, and maybe bring in more private entities into the into our programming. And oh, sorry, I've sort of crossed over the two there, but just to sort of highlight that all of this feeds into this ongoing debate over the idea of mainstreaming in PCV and what the future of PCV actually is. We recognize that people have more immediate, often more quotidian concerns, and we need to know how to make PCV more relevant to individuals who might not actually be thinking about it on a daily basis. This might necessitate rethinking what local ownership actually is. Elite CSOs, for example, are not necessarily going to be credible stakeholders. And just to go back a little bit to some of those initial ones, we need to assess local understandings of VE, which everyone always says, but often fails to do so at a granular enough level. We need to consider what Omar's just been saying about gender segregated communications, and also we need to recognize that individuals often actually share information they don't necessarily agree with, and that's something that we often fail to recognize, and I think that some of Kenya's anti-terrorism law fails to recognize. From a government perspective, I want to suggest that we want to highlight that we work really closely throughout this project with NCTC and with government actors, and they've sort of reviewed the report as well before it's going to be made public. And we also work very closely with county commissioners. And as a result, have been able to provide and work, and they've been very open to listening to our ideas, but we've been able to provide very clear advice and recommendations to government actors. A few key things here to pick out. Firstly, that government should be thinking about building brand rather than necessarily pumping out messages. Again, similar advice to what we just talked about with comms-based CVE programming. Police remain really critical, because our study really found, unsurprisingly maybe in some areas, that the police were really firstly the face of the state, but also the relationship between police and at-risk communities was really fraught. And also recognize how the movement and redeployment of police is often undermining the sort of establishment of these longer term relationships. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on just to highlight what the outputs of this project actually were, and the products which I'm going to push you towards reading. The main output is a CVE governance and communication strategy paper, which is quite a technical label for a long report, but I hope it's really accessible through sort of quite nicely sort of structured and self-contained sections. This report really highlights all our findings, and it should really be relevant well beyond Kenya's borders. I want to highlight, unfortunately, that this was uploaded last week and finally published, but we've identified certain concerns with the version that was uploaded. So we are making some changes, and hopefully within the next couple of weeks, the final version will be up and ready to read. So if you do follow the link from the invite to this event, you might not actually come across the report. It might have been removed by the time you do so. Secondly, I wrote six communication action strategy documents. These are very sort of tangible pieces of advice which people could take away and use in guiding their own communication strategies, but also their own CVE programs more broadly. One was directed at engaging government actors in CVE programs. Another was looking at religious actors and how to work better with religious actors and what religious actors can do. And then there was one document per county on maybe things to consider before working in CVE within each of these counties. A lot of this looks as well at a mainstreaming approach and tries to suggest that we need to be careful talking about PCV specific programs and rather than integrating some of these ideas and notions into broader interventions. So thank you. We're about 8 minutes over, but we still have a good 17 minutes, I think, for questions. So I'll hand over back to Lisa, who will moderate, and welcome Michael Jones and Timothy to the panel to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Christopher and Omar, for such a rich description of the research